Hello and welcome to the first lecture on Chapter 6, Learning. Learning is an enduring change in behavior resulting from experience. So right now we're going to look at learning and behavior. We're not so much focusing on, how we learn mathematics and things of that nature. We're going to be focusing on the learning of the relationship between our experiences and our behavior. So learning is the process by which experience produces a relatively permanent change in behavior or capabilities. And learning is based on our experiences. Learning is reflected by these changes in our behavior. So in order to learn, behaviorists would say we have to experience things, that we can't learn without the experience of doing something. And according to behaviorists, most of what we do is the result of learned behaviors. There's some debate about that, and we'll look at that later in this chapter. Understanding how we learn also allows us to shape our behavior, allowing us to choose our behaviors or to change undesirable behaviors. There's a lot of research on behaviorism and the development of phobias, development of addiction, issues with relationships and with parenting, and with employment. So, learning theory evolved from behaviorism. And behaviorism is a school of thought in psychology that was for a while a very predominant subspecialty in cognitive science. And behaviorists believe that we are born with the potential to learn just about anything. Behaviorists believe that every behavior has a cause, that free will is an illusion, that our behavior is a response to something in our environment, that when we engage in a behavior, it's not that we are choosing that behavior, it's that we've been triggered to respond to something in our environment, and then we demonstrate a behavior. So behaviorists believe that by manipulating the environment, we can manipulate behavior. Now, there's lots of research to support this, and I don't want to give the impression that behaviorism is no longer an important part of learning theory. It very much is. It's just that learning theory has become much more comprehensive than just behaviorism. John Watson, the father of behaviorism, stated, "Give me a dozen healthy infants, well-formed, and my own special world to bring them up in, and I'll guarantee to take any one at random and train him to become any type of specialist I might select. Doctor, lawyer, artist, merchant chief, and yes, beggar man or thief, regardless of his talents, penchants, tendencies, abilities, vocations, and race of his ancestors." I think that's a great example of how rigid the theories of behaviorism can be. There's really no room for free will. There is no room for individual differences. We are just our behavior is the result of cause and effect. So, as we study learning, we're going to look at three types of learning. We're going to look at classical conditioning, which is reflexive, and I'll explain that in a moment. We're going to look at operant conditioning, which is basically rewards and consequences, and learning by observation. And this is where we learn from watching others experience rewards and consequences. So classical conditioning occurs when we learn that two types of events go together, and this is purely reflexive. This happens on a neurological level. There's no thought process involved with classical conditioning. Operant conditioning occurs when we learn that a behavior leads to a consequence, either a reward or a punishment. And I think that's the type of learning all of you are most familiar with, the concept of rewards and consequences shaping behavior. But first, let's talk about classical conditioning. Classical conditioning was discovered by Ivan Pavlov, who was a physician studying the digestive process in dogs. I know, right? While researching digestion, Pavlov accidentally discovered classical conditioning. If you reflect back to the lectures on Chapter 2, I talked about how a lot of discoveries are accidental. Classical conditioning is one of those examples of an accidental discovery. And I'll explain that. So, Pavlov was researching salivation, and he was using dogs as his subjects. So he would present the dogs with meat, and dogs salivate whenever they smell food. He had a saliva collection device implanted in the dog's cheek, and that is how he could measure salivation, the amounts and when salivation occurred. One day, Pavlov discovered that his dogs were salivating when food wasn't presented to them. Now, at the time, it was believed that that shouldn't be possible. Why are these dogs salivating as if there's food when there isn't any food? What he found is that whenever the dogs saw one of the lab assistants responsible for feeding them, the dogs started salivating. It doesn't matter that the lab assistant did or did not have food with them. If they saw the lab assistant who was responsible for feeding them, they salivated. If they saw an empty food bowl, they salivated. Pavlov realized that his dogs began to link one stimulus with another stimulus. So, please watch the video titled, Who was Ivan Pavlov and What is Classical and Respondent Conditioning? You'll find that in the folder titled Chapter 6, Learning Lecture Videos. Welcome back. So, the video gave you a really good look at how classical conditioning works. We have food as an unconditioned stimulus. If something is unconditioned, it means you didn't have to learn a response. You didn't have to learn to behave a certain way. So, dogs did not have to learn to salivate in the presence of food. They've done that for tens of thousands of years. So, you present them with food and they salivate. That's an unconditioned stimulus, is the meat. The unconditioned response is the behavior, the salivation. Unconditioned just simply means it's not learned. Now, Pavlov wanted to research what's going on with my dogs. So he took a neutral stimulus and he wanted to see if he could train dogs to salivate. So he started using a bell. So a neutral stimulus is one that is not at all linked to the reflexive action that you're looking at. So the sound of a bell is a completely neutral stimulus. And you only want to use neutral stimuli when you're classically conditioning a subject, or yourself, or your partner, or your children, or your pets. During conditioning trials, the ringing bell is presented to the dog along with their food. So, when it's time to feed the dog, you ring the bell, give the food. Now you want to pair these together very quickly. You don't want to ring the bell, go get the meat, and then give the food. You need to be ready to feed the dog immediately. So you'd use the neutral stimulus to cause the unconditioned response. Over time, with multiple trials, the bell becomes a conditioned stimulus. It becomes a learned stimulus. Thus, once Pavlov just started ringing the bell and there's no food in the room, the dogs started to salivate. All they had to do was hear that bell. They had learned that the bell equals food, not on a cognitive level. This is just a reflexive learned behavior. And they learned that, oh, okay, the sound of the bell means food. What Pavlov did is he classically conditioned his dogs to react to a bell as if it was food. He actually got the dog's nervous systems to start salivating at the sound of a bell. So, after conditioning, the ringing bell causes the dog to salivate, and that's your conditioned response. And we'll go through some examples of this. So, the dog was conditioned to associate the bell with food. So, here's what Pavlov discovered. So, with classical conditioning, you have an unconditioned stimulus and an unconditioned response. The unconditioned response is just a physiological behavior that is unlearned. You have your conditioned stimulus, which is the stimulus that the subject learned to react to. And that created the desired conditioned response, salivation. So by linking the unconditioned stimulus with the conditioned stimulus, the conditioned response is learned. So if I give you examples on the test, let me fill in half of this equation for you. Figure out what the unconditioned stimulus is. That's going to be your conditioned response. I'm sorry, let me redo that. Figure out what your unconditioned stimulus is. Find your neutral stimulus, and that neutral stimulus will become your conditioned stimulus. Your unconditioned response and conditioned response, which is the learned response, are always the same. You've got half of the equation right there. So by linking the unconditioned stimulus with the conditioned stimulus, the conditioned response is learned. You're going to like these two videos. Please watch the video titled The Simpsons, Classical Conditioning, and The Office, Classical Conditioning. You will find those in the folder titled Chapter 6, Learning Lecture Videos on Moodle. Welcome back. So, when we're looking at all of this, the unconditioned stimulus is a stimulus that elicits a reflexive or innate response without prior learning. A dog will always salivate to food. They just will. The unconditioned response is the reflexive or innate response that is elicited by a stimulus without prior learning. And that's going to be your salivation. So in the Pavlov example, the unconditioned stimulus is food. The unconditioned response is salivation. Then Pavlov took a neutral stimuli and made that a conditioned stimulus through learning. So by pairing the bell with food, he was able to elicit a conditioned response. And that conditioned response is the learned behavior. So, examples. Sam is 3 years old. One night, while sitting in front of a fire in the fireplace, Sam is burned by a flying ember. Sam's burn is painful for several hours. Weeks later, as Sam's parents try to build another fire in the fireplace, Sam starts to cry and runs from the room. So first, think about, what is the unconditioned stimulus and what is the unconditioned response? The unconditioned stimulus is going to be what causes the burn. That's going to be the flying ember. The unconditioned response is reacting to pain. So the conditioned stimulus now becomes the fire. The conditioned response is the reaction, the fear that Sam feels when he sees the fire, and then he runs from the room. He's learned to pair the unconditioned stimulus and conditioned stimulus. So the unconditioned is the flying ember, and the conditioned stimulus is the fire. He's learned how to pair those together. It's not a cognitive process. He's not thinking through, oh, fire means pain. What he's learned is that being near fire can cause pain. So the unconditioned response is that fear to being burned by the flying ember. The conditioned response is going to be fear. So the unconditioned stimulus that initiated all this is the flying ember. The unconditioned response is fear. The conditioned stimulus becomes the fire itself, which causes the conditioned response, which is fear. He simply paired two stimuli to get these to cause the same behavior. Oops. Andrew is allergic to cats. When he is exposed to cats for half an hour, Andrew begins to sneeze and cough. After several allergic reactions, Andrew begins to sneeze and cough as soon as he sees a cat in a room. And this actually can happen through learning, through the experience of being around cats. So our unconditioned stimulus is the cat. And the unconditioned response is that allergic reaction, let's say sneezing and coughing. After multiple pairings of seeing the cat and then having that allergic response, Andrew's nervous system and his immune system learns cat equals allergic response. So the conditioned stimulus, is just the seeing of the cat. He doesn't have to be near a cat. He just has to see a cat, and he'll start having that allergic reaction, even though he hasn't even been with the cat long enough to trigger the allergy. All of a sudden, just seeing a cat triggers that allergic reaction. So the unconditioned stimulus is the cat. But Andrew has to be around the cat for about a half an hour before he has this allergic reaction. After multiple pairings of that, just seeing a cat becomes the conditioned stimulus. So just the visual of a cat. And the conditioned response becomes that allergic reaction. We'll continue with 6.2.